Hello, friends. We have another episode of Dynamically Speaking. This is a really special one, calling it the Alpha Bits episode. We're going to talk all things alpha and we'll sprinkle in a little bit of AuthZEN as well. So grab your favorite beverage, sit back, and here we go. Hey everyone, welcome to another Dynamically Speaking podcast. I'm your host, Kelly O'Dwyer-Manuel. With me, as always, the effervescent David Brossard. Hey David, how are you?
You make me sound bubbly. I'm doing good, and you?
You know what? The sun is shining today, so I can't complain. I can't complain. Yeah, it's good. I've been excited for this particular conversation for quite some time because it's a subject that I know is near and dear to your heart, and that is ALFA, the abbreviated language for authorization. So I'm going to ask you all of the things about ALFA that everybody has always wanted to know. We're going to go back to the beginning and walk us through everything that's gone on and where you think things are going next. So if you're keen for the journey, that's where I would like to start. All righty. So let's harken back to the beginning. How did ALFA come to be? What was its origin story for our superhero fans out there?
Yeah, it's an interesting story. What really happened is, if we rewind to the very beginning of externalized, fine-grained, attribute-based authorization, you have ZACML, and ZACML was born in 2001. It is a sibling to SAML in that they were both born out of the same family, Oasis, and they were born in the context of what was happening in 2001, which was everything is web services suddenly. We moved from a world where applications cannot communicate with one another, that applications written in one language are not interoperable with applications written in another language, to a world where, oh my goodness, web services are opening up doors. They're connecting things that cannot be connected before. And the king of web services was the underlying format being used, XML. And XML was used to express SOAP and all of the derivative standards that you have around SOAP, like secure messaging, eventing, federation, so on and so forth. And so in the context of that, we came up with SAML for everything that has to do with identity, federation, and authentication and single sign-on. And we came up, I say we, Oasis, and the folks at the time came up with ZACML or XACML for extensible access control. And it was XML based. And it's not just that the syntax was XML, it's also that some of the use cases ZACML aimed to address were XML centric. Let's control access to XML documents. Let's control access to XML payloads, which at the time of web services, again, back in 2001, all the way to 2010, really made a lot of sense. The technical community went really heavy on XML. And I have to confess, by the way, Kelly, it's not very fashionable to say so, but I'm a huge fan of XML. I love XML. I always thought it was a easy to understand standard, and I just do not understand why people want to go to YAML today. But that's just a side note in this conversation. So all this to say that ZACML was XML heavy, and although the format and the purpose and the goal of ZACML is not necessarily tied to XML, you can use ZACML to protect any number of resources regardless of what they represent. It still also had that XML baggage that it was carrying. So if you fast forward to 2012, 2014, we realized that at Axiomatic that writing policies in XML was a no-go. As a matter of fact, every single vendor and every single open source product up to that point, we were trying to build UIs to hide the XML and give people interfaces to create policies without having to deal with the underlying XML. Well, in 2012, 2014, we realized that, well, hang on a minute. What if we had a syntax that developers could use, a language that they could write by hand, read by hand, edit by hand, and that anyone could understand? The developers, of course, but also potentially, moving up the food chain, auditors and access reviewers that they could potentially understand whatever was written. So XML was no go for that, and that's how we came up with ALFA.
Interesting. Out of the gate, what was the reception like for Alpha? How was it received by by developers and by the authorization or access industry as a whole?
Yeah, it was a big deal. My former colleague Jerry Gable and I announced it and ran a workshop at what was then called the Cloud Identity Summit. And I think I recall this was the one in Vail. I would have to look up the exact date. But we did a workshop. It was very well received, both by the industry, the likes of Ping and ForgeRock and other companies at the time, in the authorization space and the identity space, but also our customers, developers, using Alpha and realizing it was so much easier to write policies in Alpha than it had been to write policies, of course, in XML. And it was faster than using a UI. I think that's more of a matter of preference.
Right.
If you're used to using a UI, then you're okay with point and click and all that's good. But definitely being able to work with text and copy paste and commit to Git and all these good things and integrate with your CI/CD pipeline, that made Alpha all the more important. This was kind of pre policy as code or everything as code craze, right? We're not quite, we're talking 2014. We're not quite yet in the world where developers are at the center of everything, where Git and GitHub are at the center of everything. So we're a little ahead of the curve in terms of everything as code.
Oh, that's a good point, and very very true. This was this was definitely ahead of that curve for sure, for sure. So I think, and this is going to be a question that you're going to, the answer for you is going to be obvious, but I think it's important to ask for listeners out there who might be wondering then, David, why not make this a proprietary language that's unique just to Axiomatics?
I think that's just the culture of who we are. We were early contributors and adopters of XACML, XACML. That's a standard. It's an Oasis standard. I think by the time Axiomatics joined the technical committee, we were in version 2. Our CTO and co-founder, Eric Kusanen, became the editor for XACML 3.0, and he saw through the publication and the standardization of XACML 3.0. So I think it was important to us, to the company, to contribute back to the community and make it a standard as well. And as a matter of fact, your question is a really good one, because we started off with a proprietary version of Alpha. We called it the Axiomatics language for authorization, and we decided that just having our own is not good enough. It's not fun. It's also not playing ball with the rest of the community. So we really wanted to make it a standard, and that's why we gave it back to Oasis, and it was just a natural place to be, right?
Right. So, as the years have gone by, then, what are the particular uses where Alpha has excelled, and where do you think it's maybe been underused?
So it's excelled anywhere. XACML would have been great, minus some of the baggage that made XACML a little cumbersome to work with, notably the syntax, but also some of the XML processing features that were great back in 2001 or a little irrelevant. I'm going to say today in 2010, so 14 years ago, and even more so in 2024, right? It hasn't prevented Alpha from being very successful in expressing application-centric authorization, API-centric authorization. It's always been great at doing that, right? It was not as successful in infrastructure land, but I think it's a consequence of not being visible enough. And there's always this realization that those folks, be it open source, be it vendors, be it frameworks, implementing externalized authorization, implementing a decoupled authorization, are not necessarily visible enough to those who would want to do externalized authorization. And what happens a lot of times is that someone working in, say, infrastructure, or someone working to create an app, they're going to invent their own. And
Right.
so I'm saying infrastructure because in 2015 or so, Open Policy Agent came out with a language of their own called Rego, and they did do their homework. They had looked at XACML, and they concluded that one, the XML syntax was not, for them. Infrastructure folks are very YAML heavy, of course, or even a little bit of JSON. So doing XML was just no go, and that of course makes sense, But also, what was interesting, what the founders of Rego told me was that ALFA and XACML were too limited because they're a constrained language. They focus on authorization only, whereas in Rego, there was a need for a full-blown programming language. So they came out with, of course, Rego based on data log, and that can actually do a whole lot more than what ALFA can do. It's neither good or bad. It's just slightly
Right.
different use cases. There's this need to process more data. There's this need to be able to be stateful in Rego that you do not have and you do not want to have in ALFA. You actually want it to be constrained.
And that's what I think I find fascinating about this, David, is it is in both cases, whether you're discussing Rego or whether you're discussing Alpha, it becomes almost a double-edged sword, I guess, depending upon what way you look at it. The kind of can do anything of Rego is beneficial if you want to do anything, but if you want something that's very specific to authorization, that anything might be too much. And then the inverse is true then for Alpha. How has that, is that well understood?
Not necessarily. No, I probably what happens more often is that a developer who lives and breathes a given environment is going to pick up the tools that the environment gives them. So if they happen to be in a Kubernetes environment or an infrastructure heavy environment, they're going to pick up an open policy agent just because it's there, right? They're not going to go and do an analysis of would Alpha be better than Rego for my particular use case. I think you grab the tool that is available to you. And Rego is a great choice. There's no reason to go to Alpha if you're doing infrastructure and you're happy with Rego, then great. But if you want to move up the stack and you want to start doing application authorization and you want to have better audit capabilities, easier editing capabilities as well, because Rego being more complete has a steeper learning curve, right? Then that's when you should start considering Alpha or potentially other languages. It's also where, and I'm sure you have a question later on that, where IDQL comes in because it can serve as the governing language across multiple authorization languages and help you manage the fact that you might have multiple languages in your environment.
Right. Yes, I'm 100% going to get to that. You know me well. I think so. I'm going to do something dangerous here, David. I'm going to give you a magic wand. If there was anything you could change about Alpha, add to it, take from it, what would you do?
Oh, we have a long list, a long wish list. And when I say we, it's both the folks at Axiomatics, but also a group of people that I've been talking to in the community that are interested in contributing to Alpha and seeing it through to the next stage. So I've secretly, so please don't tell anyone, been working on an idea called Alpha 2.0. And the bulk of Alpha 2.0 is two things. Number one is moving further away from the XACML language and more to an even easier to use language. And what I mean by that is when we moved from XACML to Alpha 10 years or so ago, we decided to abandon a very small set of features, very small.
Right.
We should have been more brazen about it and actually cut more corners, if you will. And we should have rationalized and streamlined the language a little bit more. And that's what I want to do in Alpha 2.0. So just to give you an example, in Alpha, there's the concept of a policy set, a policy, and a rule, RUELE. And a policy set can contain policies, a policy can contain a rule, and a rule contains a decision. So it's kind of like branches and leaves of a tree, if you will. But truth is, you only really need a branch and a leaf. You don't need different kinds of branches. Just a branch and a leaf would be enough. So all you need really is a policy and a decision. So we can simplify the language to just do policy decision. And that would make learning the language easier. It would make handling the language easier. It would make visualizing and auditing the language that much easier. There are a few other things that we want to enhance that the XACML Technical Committee actually has been working on over the past few years that we haven't moved to Alpha yet. One of them is better handling of complex data types. So I'm thinking of tuples or hierarchical data types. Today in Alpha and in XACML and the core spec, you deal with primitive types, of which there are many, right? So it could be string, date, time, IP address, Boolean, so on and so forth. But anything that expresses a relationship or a hierarchy is not easily expressed. That's also something that we want to add natively into Alpha to have a better support for hierarchies. It's in particular especially important if you want to tackle reback relationship-based access control better than what we do today.
That's a pretty thoughtful list. So, and here comes the question you were waiting for. We know there's Open Policy Agent. We know there's ALFA. There are lots of options out there. What that does is, in a very positive way, provides a viable option to suit a particular use case if you want to really be purpose driven about how you're implementing authorization. On the flip side, as we've discussed many times, and I know across the industry, across our industry, this discussion has taken place many times. It does make things complicated and confusing for enterprises, any organization really that's looking to implement authorization. So where is this going, David? Is the end game here going to be one language to rule them all? With ALFA, is it going to continue to be a combination of such? Where does this end up, do you think?
So there's different angles to consider. I think first off, I don't think there will ever be one language to rule them all. If
Right.
there is, it could be IDQL maybe. So IDQL is a language that aims to provide governance on top of other authorization languages. It is something developed as part of a framework called Hexa, HEXA. It's some that framework is developed by a company called Strata Identity. It's a really good idea. What they want to do is sit on top of ALFA, XACML, Rego, other languages, proprietary languages like Cedar or Cerbos or others, and provide an abstraction layer so that you can govern your policies, much like you have GRC products for identity today, right? But
Right.
they do not aim to be a runtime engine, at least not now. So that doesn't make them a competitor to OPA or an Alpha PDP or anything else, at least for now. But I don't think it's bad for enterprise to have both um, uh, Rego and Alpha and another language. I think that's okay. It might be that you have different teams that want to use different languages. It's a bit like you have teams that work in .NET, others that work in Python, others that work in Java. And for sure, you probably don't want to have too many languages out there, but you also want to acknowledge the fact that maybe the use cases for those teams is better suited to Python versus Java, and therefore let them work in Python and give them the tooling to support that, right? The same is a little true of authorization. And if you have the right abstraction layer like IDQL, then you can actually achieve pretty good results. Now, that being said, I also want, wearing my alpha hat, I also want to raise the awareness of alpha, tell folks both in the standards communities, but also in the development communities, hey guys, if you have an externalized authorization use case, these are the patterns you should consider. This is the language you should consider. Tell my peers in the OAuth world who are working on rich authorization requests, for instance, oh, you could use alpha as a means to express a policy within rich authorization requests. Or tell the identity providers who might have some authorization logic inside of their products, well, you could actually use alpha as a means to express these uh, authorization conditions, if you will. So that's kind of what I want to do. And side note, there is a working group, which I know you know, Kelly, called AuthZEN at the OpenID Foundation. AuthZEN focuses on raising the awareness around authorization, on providing more interoperability on authorization, but it stops short of providing a language. So it will never, at least for now, the goal is not to provide an authorization language, but rather to provide the awareness around the existence of such languages, such as Alpha, such as Rego, and other languages.
Yes, and I think the work AuthZEN is doing is going to be so critical to improving, just in general, understanding of what externalized authorization is, how you can implement it in a way that's going to be pragmatic and successful, which sounds very marketing speak, but is really true because I know that that's a struggle for a lot of organizations is how in the sweet hack do you get this going in a way that's going to work for your organization. There is no easy button here. So I think what AuthZen is doing is going to be so critical to moving the market forward and moving adoption forward. So I'm so excited about what you all are able to do. And I mean, to that end, David, do you want to expand a little bit on kind of as we talk about the future of languages, what's next with AuthZEN? Because we brought this up in earlier episodes, but I know that, there's been some meteor updates of late.
Yeah, so in the very, very short term, what's next with AuthZEN is the interop at the end of the month at Identiverse in Vegas. We have a session on the Tuesday, so the opening day of the conference from 10 a.m. to roughly 3 p.m. to actually get our hands dirty, dive into the interops, try out, the different implementations. So to date, Asserto, Signal, Cerbos, Cogito, and Axiomatics have achieved interop on the AuthZEN implementers draft. I know that our friends over at Strata are on the brink of doing as much. So this is really, really good news, and we would love other players to take part. The more the merrier. The Axiomatics implementation actually is interesting in that because we are XACML based, the work that we did can be reused by any XACML compliant vendor or any XACML compliant implementation. So some of my former peers at Thales Group, they have a XACML PDP. I could actually front the proxy that I wrote for Axiomatics on top of their own PDP and make them interoperable. But that's in the short term. In the longer term, we're already starting to think about different APIs. So the one API we're doing the interop on is a simple binary yes/no permit deny API, very similar to what we had in XACML. Simplified, streamlined, makes it easier for developers. The second one that we're starting to discuss is a multiple decision or a box scarring API, where instead of sending a single request, you can send a request that contains multiple questions. And instead of getting a single decision inside of a single response, you're going to get an array of decisions inside of a response. So that allows you to ask questions like, hey, can Alice view item 1, item 2, item 3, item 4, item 5 in one go? So that's going to increase the performance of your authorization framework. And then moving further, the next API that we want to tackle, and that one's going to be a little harder, is an API that my peer at Signal has been calling search, that the folks at Open Policy Agent call partial evaluation, that we call reverse query on Axiomatics. It's essentially an ability to ask a reverse question. So instead of saying, can Alice view record 1, we're going to go build an API that can let you ask the question, hey, tell me what Alice can do, or hey, tell me who can view record 1. So that's the future in the medium term, I would say.
That's amazing. That's amazing. If folks want to learn more, so this is a twofold question, I suppose. If folks want to learn more about ALFA, David, obviously they can go to axiomatics.com. We have a number of both specific and general pieces to share. But I know that you also developed an alpha guide. Do you want to share a little bit how people can navigate there to learn a bit more about alpha?
Sure. So one thing that I realized really early on was that standards communities, and I don't know if it's specific to Oasis, I think it's true of many standards communities. I should say, we're great at writing specs. We're not necessarily great at writing user guides. And so much like IETF has OAuth, and then Aaron Parecki, who's one of the founding fathers or main contributors to OAuth, created an OAuth.net website to provide articles and videos and tutorials on how to use OAuth. I did the same thing for Alpha. I launched a website last December. I had nothing better to do at Christmas, called alpha.guide, that has a series of examples, tutorials, information on the language that is kind of like a different way to digest the spec. Instead of having to go read a pretty dry document, you can go to alpha.guide. There is actually a couple playgrounds you can play with on that site. One of them has been provided by Rock Solid Knowledge, tech company out of the UK, who use Alpha natively in .NET environments. There is the AuthZEN compatible PDP that we're running on that site as well, pdp.alpha.guide if you want to try it out. So there's a lot of resources. And on there, we're just starting with a Slack community. So there's a link to a Slack workspace that you can click on and sign up to. And if you do, I'll get a notification and I'll be able to actually help you out with the questions that you may have and whatever it is you want to do with Alpha. We've also been using Stack Overflow quite a bit. So if you have Alpha specific questions, you could always go to Stack Overflow, ask your questions there, and I'll get a notification and try to help you as best as I can.
That's fantastic. And now I know here's a really good question for you. You're a dad. Over Christmas, what was more complicated, writing the ALFA guide or putting together the toys that your kids received over the holidays?
um, well, I'm probably a really bad dad because I picked toys I like. So that was easy. I'm a huge fan of this German toy brand called Playmobil. And my daughter doesn't get a say as to whether she likes them. She's being brainwashed into liking them. So that was easy. That was relatively easy.
Well, that's good. That's good. We had to implement a rule that if the gift giver couldn't put it together, then it would not be well received. So that has worked in some instances. Nothing's perfect.
Nice.
And before we wrap up, for those interested in following AuthZEN, where can they go for more information on that?
Yep, they can go to the OpenID Foundation website. I need to look up the URL, but it's probably something along the lines of OpenID, openid.net. And then if you go to openid.net/WG, as in work group, /AuthZEN, AUTHZEN, or AUTHZEN for those Canadians out there in the audience, you will get to the AuthZEN working group.
Fantastic. Fantastic. Thanks again, David. Always a fascinating conversation. Really excited, folks. If you enjoyed this episode, please, give it a like, subscribe. We're now available on, I think, most of the major platforms where you can find podcasts. So that is crazy exciting. Be sure to share this with anyone you know who may be an authorization fan or wants to learn more. If you are attending Identiverse at the end of May, please remember to stop by the Axiomatics booth 2415. David and I will both be there. Would love to meet folks and hear about what you like about our podcast. If you're listening, what you'd like us to cover in future episodes. Other than that, we're also looking to have a very special Identiverse episode. I don't want to spoil it, but we're hoping to have some special guests and have a pretty decent conversation there. So yeah, thanks again, David, for the time. Deeply appreciate it. And everyone, we'll hope to see you at Identiverse.
My pleasure. And Kelly, one more thing, if I may.
Of course.
If you're interested in authorization, which if you've been listening all the way, you are interested in authorization, do not deny it. In addition to the interop taking place on Tuesday at Identiverse, the day before, on the Monday, therefore, at 7 p.m., a bunch of authorization folks, people from the AuthZEN working group, but also people from the AuthZ Substack are getting together for drinks at Brewdog. I think it's called Brewdog Brewery in Vegas, the rooftop. It's one of the quieter places in Vegas, which is kind of nice when you're in Vegas. So join us. Please join us.
Would love to see folks there. So again, thanks so much. Take care, and we will see you next time.
We hope you enjoyed this episode of Dynamically Speaking. Stay tuned for our next one, and in the meantime, check the show notes and connect with us on LinkedIn and YouTube. And visit us at axiomatics.com to learn more about our authorization solution.